He walked into the courtroom like he owned it, convinced his badge would protect him like it always had. But when the judge refused to play his game, his world came crashing down fast. The tension in Birmingham District Court was already thick before the first word was spoken. The case on the docket was controversial. Another police brutality lawsuit. Another officer accused of excessive force against an unarmed black man. The city had seen too many of these cases, and the public had stopped believing in justice a long time ago. The courtroom was full, journalists with notepads in hand, families waiting for answers, and community members who had seen this play out before. At the center of it all was Judge Imani Thompson. She was a force of nature, known for her firm but fair rulings. With 15 years on the bench, she had seen every kind of case imaginable: violent criminals, crooked politicians, corporate fraud, and yes, far too many officers accused of abusing their power. She didn't play favorites. She didn't tolerate nonsense. She believed in the law. But there was something about today that felt different. The moment she stepped into the courtroom, she felt the weight of the stairs. Some hopeful, some skeptical, some waiting for her to fail. She adjusted her robe, sat down, and looked at the file before her. State of Alabama v. Officer Mark Reynolds. The name wasn't new to her. Officer Reynolds had been in and out of court too many times, but never in the defendant's seat. Every single complaint, excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, had been dismissed, buried, or explained away. But this time, the evidence was different. There was video, witnesses, a man in the hospital fighting for his life, and Reynolds himself? A 30-year veteran of the force, decorated on paper but feared in the streets. His reputation among the black community was no secret. If he pulled you over, you knew it wouldn't end well. And yet he always walked away untouched, his record spotless. Judge Thompson exhaled. She had handled difficult cases before, but when it came to law enforcement accountability, the stakes were always higher. She had been called biased for simply holding officers to the same standard as civilians. She had been threatened, targeted, and labeled a problem. But she had never let that shake her. Today wouldn't be any different. She turned to the plaintiff's attorney, a young black woman named Danielle Pierce, and gave her a firm nod. "Ready to begin?" Danielle adjusted her blazer and stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned to the defense table, where Mark Reynolds sat with his attorney, Russell Keegan, a well-known lawyer who specialized in getting officers off the hook. "Your Honor, the defense is ready," Keegan said, his voice smooth, confident. He wasn't worried. He had done this dance before. But Judge Thompson barely looked at him. Her eyes were on Reynolds. The way he sat there, arms folded, jaw clenched, eyes full of resentment. Not an ounce of remorse. It was going to be a long day. But no one in that room, not the attorneys, not the jury, not even Reynolds himself, had any idea just how far things would go. From the moment Judge Imani Thompson took the bench, it was clear she wasn't someone to be underestimated. She wasn't just another judge in a robe, reading from a script. She commanded the room, not with theatrics, but with presence. There was a sharpness in her eyes, an unmistakable authority in her voice. Even the most seasoned lawyers knew, when you stood before Judge Thompson, you better come prepared. But power was never handed to her. She had fought for it. Born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, Imani knew early on that the world wasn't built to protect people like her. She saw it firsthand, how the law worked differently depending on where you lived, what you looked like, who you knew. She watched her father, a small business owner, get harassed by police for no reason. She saw her brother pulled over and frisked at 17, accused of looking suspicious in his own neighborhood. But instead of letting anger consume her, she made a decision. She would fight the system from the inside. She put herself through law school at Howard University, working nights at a diner, studying until her eyes burned. When she finally became a public defender, she didn't just take cases, she fought for people's lives. She took on clients others ignored, families who had been silenced, names that didn't make the news. And now, as a judge, she had only one mission: justice, no matter who was sitting in front of her. But today was different. There was an energy in the courtroom, not just tension, but something heavier, more dangerous. The jury sat stiff, unsure of what kind of trial this would be. On one side, the victim's family, holding each other's hands, praying. On the other, officers from Reynolds' precinct, sitting tall in their uniforms, staring straight ahead. And then there was Mark Reynolds himself. He hadn't said a word, but his body spoke for him. The way his fingers tapped against the table, the slight curl of his lip, the way his eyes locked onto Judge Thompson's as if daring her to challenge him. She had seen his type before. Men who believed their badge made them untouchable. Men who thought authority was a weapon, not a responsibility. But she didn't flinch. "Officer Reynolds, please stand," she said, her tone even. He stood slowly, deliberately. Broad shoulders squared, chin lifted, staring her down. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Do you understand the charges against you?" A pause. Then, with a voice that dripped with arrogance, Reynolds spoke for the first time. "Yeah, Judge. I understand just fine." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The victim's family tensed. The reporters' pens scratched against their notepads. But Imani didn't react. She had dealt with smug defendants, men who thought they were above the law, men who believed they could intimidate her into submission. She wasn't intimidated. "Then let's proceed," she said simply, turning to the prosecution. "Miss Pierce, you may begin." Danielle Pierce stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, the prosecution will present evidence proving that Officer Reynolds used unjustifiable, excessive force against an unarmed civilian, resulting in near-fatal injuries. We will show that his actions were not only reckless, but a clear abuse of power." Reynolds scoffed. Imani turned her head sharply. "Something funny, Officer Reynolds?" He smirked, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. Just listening," the way he said it, like he wasn't taking this seriously. Imani's fingers tapped lightly on the gavel. This wasn't just another trial. It was a test. Not just for Reynolds, but for her. She had spent her entire career proving that the law applied to everyone, badge or not. And today, she was about to prove it again. But what she didn't know, Reynolds wasn't just another arrogant cop. He was something much worse. The courtroom had seen its fair share of arrogant defendants, but Mark Reynolds was something else. He walked in late. Not technically late, but later than he should have been, making sure everyone was already in place before he arrived. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. The heavy doors swung open, and Reynolds strode in like he owned the place. No hesitation, no humility, just unshakable confidence. His uniform, pressed, pristine, polished, wasn't necessary for court, but he wore it anyway. He wanted the jury to see the badge first, not the man behind it. Judge Imani Thompson watched him approach the defense table, eyes sharp. She had seen his type before. Men who walked into courtrooms not as defendants, but as untouchables. Men who thought the law was something they enforced, not something they had to answer to. He didn't sit right away. He took his time, glancing around the room, sizing up the jury, letting his presence settle in. His attorney, Russell Keegan, gave a small nod, a silent cue to finally sit. Reynolds did. Slowly, deliberately, leaning back in his chair like this was an inconvenience, not a trial. The victim's family sat just a few feet away. A mother whose son lay in a hospital bed, fighting to recover. A father gripping the edge of the bench, trying not to explode. And yet, Reynolds didn't look at them. Not once. Instead, his eyes landed on one person, Judge Thompson. There was something behind that stare. Not just arrogance, not just defiance. Something darker. A challenge. Imani held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away. She wouldn't give him what he wanted. But that didn't stop him from trying. As the court clerk began reading the charges, assault, excessive force, misconduct in public office, Reynolds didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't fidget, didn't react. When the prosecution laid out their opening statements, he smirked once. Just once. And when Danielle Pierce, the young but fierce attorney, turned directly to him, saying, "This trial will prove that no one, not even those who wear a badge, is above the law," he actually chuckled. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. But Judge Thompson heard it. Her fingers pressed against the smooth wood of her bench, steady but firm. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "is there something you'd like to share with the court?" Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth, just listening. That same line, the same words he had used earlier, but now dripping with even more sarcasm. Imani's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second before she moved on. She had handled worse. Men like Reynolds thrived on reaction. They wanted to see people squirm, see fear, see intimidation work in real time. But today, he wasn't in control. Still, something about his confidence didn't sit right. It wasn't just arrogance. It was certainty. Like he knew something the rest of them didn't. And as much as Imani had prepared for this trial, for the hostility, the tension, the weight of what it meant, there was one thing she hadn't prepared for. Just how far Mark Reynolds was willing to go. The case had barely begun, but the air in the courtroom was already charged. Danielle Pierce stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression controlled, but her voice carried weight. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove that Officer Mark Reynolds used excessive force, violating both department protocol and the victim's civil rights." She turned toward the jury, making sure to meet their eyes. "We will present video evidence, witness testimony, and medical reports that leave no room for doubt." Reynolds barely looked at her. He sat back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He was a man who had sat through countless hearings like this and walked out untouched. Danielle continued, "We'll also present documentation showing that Officer Reynolds has been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, complaints that, until now, have never resulted in disciplinary action." At that, Reynolds let out a soft scoff. Not loud, but loud enough. Judge Imani Thompson turned her attention to him immediately. "Officer Reynolds, you will not interrupt these proceedings again. Is that clear?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat there, staring. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, but there was no real respect in his tone. Just patience. The kind of patience that felt like a warning. Danielle glanced at Judge Thompson, waiting for permission to continue. With a slight nod from the bench, she moved forward. "We would like to call our first witness to the stand, the victim, Elijah Carter." A murmur spread through the room as the double doors opened. Elijah was wheeled in by his mother. His face was still bruised, stitches lining his forehead. His left arm was in a cast. The damage was fresh, raw, undeniable. And yet Reynolds didn't look at him. Elijah's mother helped him onto the witness stand, her hand squeezing his shoulder before she stepped back. Danielle approached him carefully. "Elijah, can you describe what happened on the night of March 12th? Elijah hesitated. He wasn't much older than 21, and his voice still held the weight of someone trying to convince himself that the world wasn't as cruel as it had shown him. "I was walking home," he said, voice low. "I cut through an alley near my apartment. I'd done it 100 times before." He swallowed. "That's when I saw the headlights." Danielle nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I heard the siren, then the voice telling me to stop, so I stopped." He looked down at his lap, gripping the arm of his chair. "I didn't run. I didn't argue. I did everything you're supposed to do." His mother wiped away a tear. Danielle's voice remained steady. "And then what happened?" Elijah exhaled shakily. "He told me to put my hands up. I did. Then he told me to get on my knees." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And then he charged at me." The room went still. Danielle's face remained neutral. "When you say charged, Do you mean he tackled you? Elijah's hands clenched into fists on his lap. I mean he slammed me to the ground, hit me, again and again, even after I stopped moving, even after I stopped fighting back. His mother closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking. Danielle turned toward the prosecution's table. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit A into evidence. The body camera footage of the arrest. Judge Thompson nodded. Proceed. A screen lit up at the front of the courtroom. The video was grainy, shaky, but the events were unmistakable. Elijah on his knees, hands up, Reynolds moving toward him fast. No hesitation, no warning. A brutal tackle, fists slamming into Elijah's ribs, his face hitting the pavement. The muffled sound of his gasps, the plea, the silence that followed. The room was silent as the footage ended. Finally, Judge Thompson turned to Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, do you have anything to say before we proceed? He sat up, cracked his knuckles, and for the first time he smiled. Yes, Your Honor, he said smoothly. But what came next, no one was ready for. A smile. That was his reaction. Not shock, not remorse. A smile. Judge Imani Thompson took in Mark Reynolds' expression, studying the way he sat there, too relaxed for a man watching his own violence play out on screen. Go ahead, Officer Reynolds, she said, her tone steady. You had something to say? Reynolds leaned forward, elbows on the defense table, his fingers interlaced like he was having a casual conversation. I just find it interesting, Your Honor. How people only see what they wanna see. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Danielle Pierce, standing by the prosecution's table, took a slow breath. Are you denying that you used excessive force? Reynolds shrugged. What I'm saying is, context matters. His voice was smooth, controlled. That footage doesn't show everything. It doesn't show how I'd been chasing this kid for blocks. It doesn't show the way he looked at me like he was about to run, like he had something to hide. Elijah stiffened in his seat. I wasn't running, he said, his voice sharp. I was walking home. Reynolds finally turned to face him, and the smirk faded slightly. For the first time, there was something else in his expression. Not arrogance, not amusement. Something colder. You were in a high-crime area, Reynolds said, tilting his head. It was late. And you matched a description. Judge Thompson sat forward, placing both hands on the bench. Officer Reynolds, are you suggesting that this young man's mere presence justified your response? Reynolds didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he let out a quiet chuckle. With all due respect, Judge, he said, you and I both know how this works. And that was it. That single sentence sent a wave of tension through the room, thick and suffocating. Because it wasn't just an answer, it was an admission. Not of guilt, but of how the system worked. Of how men like Reynolds knew they would always be protected. Of how this courtroom, this trial, this entire process, none of it scared him. Judge Thompson felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent her entire career fighting against this very mindset. Against the silent rules, the quiet nods, the unspoken understanding between men like Reynolds and the people who let them get away with it. She tapped her fingers against the bench, just once. Let's be clear, Officer Reynolds, she said. You are not in this courtroom as a police officer. You are here as a defendant. And if you believe that your position will shield you from accountability, you are sorely mistaken. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Reynolds held her gaze, his smirk twitching at the edges. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Just for a second. Something close to irritation. Keegan, his lawyer, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Reynolds exhaled through his nose and gave a small nod. Understood, Your Honor, he said, leaning back again, but he was still smiling. Judge Thompson turned to Danielle. Proceed with your next witness. Danielle hesitated, then nodded. The prosecution calls Sergeant Michael Owens to the stand. The doors opened, and a uniformed officer walked in. Owens was in his 40s, graying at the temples, his posture stiff as he made his way to the witness stand. He had served with Reynolds for years. As he was sworn in, Reynolds' expression finally changed. The smile vanished. because now one of his own was about to speak. Sergeant Michael Owens took his seat at the witness stand, his uniform pressed, his posture rigid. He looked straight ahead, jaw tight, avoiding Reynolds' gaze. Danielle Pierce wasted no time. "Sergeant Owens, how long have you worked with Officer Reynolds?" Owens cleared his throat. 12 years. "And in those 12 years, have you ever witnessed Officer Reynolds using excessive force?" The courtroom went still. Owens shifted slightly in his seat, fingers tapping against his knee. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Judge Imani Thompson gave a sharp glance toward the gallery, and the voices died down instantly. Danielle stepped forward. "Can you clarify what you mean by yes?" Owens exhaled. "I mean, yes, I've seen it before. This wasn't the first time." From the defense table, Reynolds finally moved. His shoulders squared, his lips pressed together, his hands resting on the table curled into fists. Danielle's voice remained steady. "And did you ever report it?" Owens hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, "No." "Why not?" Owens' jaw tightened. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, "Because no one would have listened." That single sentence hung in the air like a slap. Reynolds turned to face Owens fully now, his face blank, but his eyes burning. Danielle let the moment settle before asking, "Sergeant, do you believe Officer Reynolds used excessive force against Elijah Carter?" Owens didn't hesitate this time. "Yes." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of a journalist's pen snapping in half. Judge Thompson banged her gavel. "Order in the court!" Slowly the noise died down, but the energy had changed, because now one of their own had spoken out. Danielle nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Thompson turned toward the defense. "Mr. Keegan, your witness." Keegan stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He approached the stand slowly, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Sergeant Owens," he said, voice smooth. "How long have you worked for this department?" Owens straightened. 17 years. "And in 17 years you've never spoken up about Officer Reynolds before?" Owens hesitated. "No." Keegan tilted his head. "And yet today, suddenly, you have a lot to say." Owens' fingers clenched into a fist on his lap. "I should have said something earlier." Keegan smiled, shaking his head. "That's convenient." Reynolds let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Owens glanced at him but didn't react. Keegan turned back to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Thompson exhaled slowly. She could see exactly what Keegan was doing, discrediting the witness, planting doubt in the jury's minds. But then something shifted. Reynolds moved. Not much, just a slight roll of his shoulders, but Judge Thompson saw it. And so did Owens. The sergeant tensed, his fingers flexing. Reynolds wasn't just watching him, he was warning him. Judge Thompson glanced toward security, just in case. Danielle Pierce stood again. "Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to rest our case." Judge Thompson nodded. "Very well." She turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Keegan, does the defense wish to call any witnesses?" Keegan shook his head. "No witnesses, Your Honor, just a motion." Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Keegan stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented today, the defense moves for an immediate dismissal of all charges against Officer Reynolds." Silence. Then an explosion of voices. The victim's family gasped. A reporter cursed under their breath. Even some of the jury members looked shocked. Judge Thompson's fingers tightened around her gavel. She turned toward Keegan, her voice sharp. "On what grounds?" Keegan's smirk deepened. "Lack of credibility from the state's key witness." He gestured toward Owens. "Sergeant Owens has admitted that he withheld crucial information for years. His sudden testimony is nothing more than an attempt to protect his own career." Judge Thompson felt her pulse in her ears. This was what they did. They bent the system, twisted it, manipulated it, until accountability became impossible. Her stomach tightened, because she could already see it. The story on the news, the headlines, the backlash. This case was slipping away, and Mark Reynolds knew it. He sat back, watching her, his smirk back in place, like he had already won. But what he didn't know was that Judge Imani Thompson wasn't done. The courtroom was still in chaos. Gasps, murmurs, the weight of disbelief settling over the room like a thick fog. Judge Imani Thompson could feel it. The shift, the way power moved in rooms like this, the way truth didn't always mean justice. Keegan stood tall, adjusting his tie, his smirk barely concealed. "Your Honor, the defense's motion for immediate dismissal." "Denied." The word cut through the noise like a blade. Keegan blinked, caught off guard. Even Reynolds' smirk faltered for a second. Judge Thompson placed both hands on the bench, leaning forward slightly. "This case will proceed to closing arguments. The jury will decide." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. That arrogant, practiced confidence never wavering. Keegan cleared his throat. "Understood, Your Honor." But Judge Thompson wasn't finished. She turned her gaze directly to Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, stand up." A flicker of hesitation. Just a flicker. But then he stood, shoulders squared. Judge Thompson kept her expression neutral. "I need to make something clear," she said. "To you. To everyone in this courtroom." The room held its breath. Justice is not a favor. It is not a negotiation. It is not reserved for those who wear a badge while denied to those who don't. It applies to all. Reynolds barely blinked. Judge Thompson let the silence stretch. Then, "This trial is not about protecting you. It is about holding you accountable. If you believe otherwise, you are mistaken." And for the first time since this case began, Reynolds' smirk vanished completely. A shift. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. Because for the first time, he was looking at a system he couldn't bend. The jury was watching. The cameras were rolling. The weight of what was happening was no longer in his control. Then, the doors burst open. Every head turned as a court officer rushed in, breathless. "Your Honor," he said urgently, "the FBI is here." The entire courtroom froze. Judge Thompson straightened. "Excuse me?" The officer hesitated, then stepped forward, handing her a file. "They have a federal indictment, Your Honor, against Officer Reynolds." A collective gasp swept through the room. Reynolds' face drained of color. Judge Thompson scanned the papers quickly. Then her lips pressed together as she looked back up. She turned toward Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, I am ordering you into federal custody, effective immediately." Reynolds' mouth opened slightly, his arrogance cracking at the edges. Keegan shot up from his seat. "Your Honor." "This is out of my hands now, Mr. Keegan." And just like that, everything changed. 2 federal agents entered the courtroom, their movements quick, efficient. They moved toward Reynolds, pulling out handcuffs. He took a step back instinctively, his hands twitching. And that's when Judge Thompson saw it. The moment it clicked for him. For years he had walked into courtrooms untouched, knowing he would walk back out the same way. But not today. Today, he wasn't the one in control. "Turn around," one of the agents said. Reynolds hesitated. 1 beat. 2. Then his jaw clenched, his fingers flexed. And for a split second, he moved. A shift of his stance. A slight adjustment. The reflex of a man who had spent years getting his way through force. But before he could do anything, Judge Thompson stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move from behind her bench. She just spoke. "Don't be a coward now." And just like that, he stopped. Something about the way she said it. Low, even, final. Reynolds' fists clenched at his sides, his entire body stiffened. But he didn't move again. The agent stepped forward, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. Click, click. And for the first time in his career, Mark Reynolds was the one being led out of a courtroom in handcuffs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Not the jury, not the journalists scribbling furiously in their notepads, not Elijah Carter's family, watching with quiet, exhausted relief. And certainly not Judge Imani Thompson. She watched as he was taken away, her face unreadable. Then, finally, she picked up her gavel, and with one swift motion, she brought it down. Court is adjourned. Justice doesn't always come easily. It doesn't always arrive when it should. But sometimes, the truth is too loud to be ignored. This wasn't just about one case, one officer, one moment in time. This was about a system that had protected men like Mark Reynolds for too long. But power isn't permanent. And no one, no matter how many years they've hidden behind a badge, can outrun accountability forever. What do you think? Should more cases like this be pushed into the national spotlight? Should bad cops face consequences the way anyone else would? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you believe in justice, if you believe in the power of truth, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because these stories, they need to be told.